Good afternoon. I am so pleased to be here with you today, and I'm very grateful to also be here just around the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act here in the city of Austin, because Austin, as many of you know, or as many of you are about to find out, I've been clued into some of your discussions before me and some that are coming, has been integral in fair housing and federally funded housing in this country. As many of you know, President Lyndon Baines Johnson was the one who fought for, as president, and signed the Fair Housing Act, but he was involved with housing long before that when he was a congressman. And I'll get into that in a moment, but I'm going to give you a little bit about my background in addition to what Dr. Saldana had mentioned. So for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet me, I came to this role in a kind of a circuitous way. So my mom and dad met in the Army. My dad used to fix planes, my mom used to fix planes, and my mom used to jump out of them. As many of you know, I know that there are probably more than a few veterans in here. The military can be very difficult on families, and my family was no different. And my parents ended up splitting when I was probably about 3 and my brother was an infant. We ended up moving in with some relatives, and unfortunately, that situation became quickly untenable. So much so that we ended up fleeing in the night, and my brother, mother, and I ended up living out of a kiddie pool outside of a Texaco, not very far from Fort Bliss, where my mom once served. What helped us get everything together was good community leadership that helped my mom obtain a HUD voucher, which helped me get the stability that I needed so that I could become the first in my family to go to college. I was able to, as Dr. Saldana noted, become the first Black woman and the first Latina serving on the Carrollton Farmers Branch School Board in North DFW area. And community leaders were able to then come together and help me to continue my advocacy. My run for Congress, I lost by 1 point. Who's counting? Or recounting. But a lot of the folks that I'd worked with still believed in me and recommended that I apply for appointeeship under the Biden-Harris administration. And so a lot of the work that I've had, a lot of those lived experiences, the kind of experience where you don't expect to ever become a political appointee, is what brought me here before you today and has enabled me to represent Secretary Fudge in Texas, where my heart is, and also Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Also places that I've come to know and love as my home away from home throughout the region. So I bring my whole self to the work that I do because I share a lot of the experiences with those I've served. I have witnessed up close, as many of you have, working on the ground, the impact and the trauma that homelessness and housing insecurity can have on multiple generations. And as a woman who's both a proud Mexican American and a proud African American, I'm more than acutely aware of the impacts on each of these communities when you have segregation, when you have inequitable outcomes baked into the system in which we happen to have. And it's one of the reasons that I am so proud to serve in this administration under this specific secretary. I no shade on the other ones. I so much love for all of them, but the specific secretary is in a unique place where she is ensuring that, as one of my favorite Texans, Barbara Jordan, once said, we have an America that's as good as its promise. So the Fair Housing Act is, as many of you know, a landmark civil rights law. It was promoted by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and a week after he was assassinated, President Johnson was able to advocate, along with many wonderful legislators, to ensure its passage and signing. So this was on April 11th, 1968, so about 55 years and 10 days ago. Along those lines, our Fair Housing Month theme for this year is Choices for All Voices, Building an Equitable Future. And as we commemorate our progress toward advancing housing rights, HUD proudly is committed to expanding and protecting fair housing for future generations as well. We acknowledge that in the past, fair housing enforcement has been less than optimal, and that's putting it nicely. We're having lunch. Austin as a city has played an integral role, as I mentioned before, in the history of public housing in the United States. Some of you may not know this, but Austin is the first city to have segregated African American public housing. Now, I heard there was some discussion of this morning, so maybe all of you already know this. A couple of months ago, I had the honor of being present with community leaders, including Congressman Greg Casad, then Mayor Adler, and Lucy Baines Johnson, while HACA, or the Housing Authority of the City of Austin, broke ground at Rosewood Court. Rosewood Court was originally completed in 1939 under the New Deal and was the first ever, again, federally funded project by the U.S. Housing Authority, thanks largely to lobbying from LBJ. It was President Johnson's intention to ensure that Black and Mexican families had access to affordable housing because the conditions he'd personally witnessed as he walked amongst his constituents, and he considered everybody living in his district constituents, and that's a big deal, were facing deplorable conditions. Families, one notable instance was a family that had, I think, 11 folks in it, one of whom, the father was dying. They lived in a single room that served as the kitchen and the bathroom and the bedroom for all 10 of these folks. He said that he came there around Christmas Day, and there was no awareness of the fact that it was Christmas Day for this family, because they were in no position to have even the smallest vestige of celebration for this. And it was an experience that stuck with him. And so he did the work to get the funding brought to Austin to make sure that housing was available for everyone. The land on which Rosewood Courts was built was formerly Emancipation Park, first bought by formerly enslaved people and used for years to celebrate Juneteenth. Unfortunately, the city used eminent domain to take these 17 acres away from the Black community that owned it, despite there being other vacant land nearby. It was the city leaders' intention to keep Black people exclusively in East Austin. According to Richard Rothstein, and I'm sure some of you have read The Color of Law, and if you haven't, it is a critical book to understanding the very foundation of housing in America. Austin, at the time, much like many other cities, was trying to get around Buchanan v. Worley. So this is a Supreme Court decision that explicitly forbade segregated zoning. So in order to get around this, localities would refrain from explicitly, zoning, but they would take Black services, Black infrastructure, and they would shut it down. So in Austin, for instance, there were Black schools that were not inside East Austin specifically that were closed down, and it just forced these families to move into East Austin. So this heavily reinforced segregation, and it kept Austin, or East Austin, Black until fairly recently. And there's issues of hypergentrification that work in this measure, but this is a different discussion. I want to say, though, that Rosewood Court was an example of the failure of the adage separate but equal. The city ensured that Rosewood Court, not just over 5 years or over 10 years, but over multiple decades, received minimal investment, with much of the same infrastructure that remained in these buildings for over 80 years. So old pipes, no central heating or central air, very, very minimal movement in the direction of decency, of dignity for the folks that were living there. And that is why it brought me unique joy to see that in recognition of these uncorrected systemic inequities, HACA has done an incredible job at looking at ways to expand affordable housing in Austin for everyone, including building completely new units at Rosewood Courts, making 13 homes available for purchase specifically for low-income families. HACA worked hard with the former mayor, Mayor Adler, and got the ball rolling on ensuring that individuals with disabilities, the elderly, and families receive greater access to housing. And again, I reiterate, I bring this up because this story is baked into the very foundation of the history of fair housing, not just in Austin, not just in Texas, but in the United States as a whole. Now, as many of you here already know, fair housing covers more than federally backed properties. The Fair Housing Act protects the right of every American to obtain housing regardless of race, color, religion, sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity, national origin, familial status, or disability. The Biden-Harris administration is doing substantial work to ensure that Americans, regardless of whether they are renting or buying homes, have both protections against discrimination and the tools for fairer access. And frankly, we have our work cut out for us. But I'm proud of HUD's role as an advocate and an enforcer of the laws that demand equity for every American. At HUD, fully enforcing fair housing is key to our work. The purpose of this act was to prevent housing discrimination and to eliminate patterns of racial and ethnic segregation that have long existed in our neighborhoods and communities across the United States. 55 years later, as we are still seeing segregation in our neighborhoods and we're seeing inequity of resources as a result, the Fair Housing Act is still serving as an important tool for ensuring justice and dignity in our housing system. We have to use this law to the fullest extent possible. Ending housing discrimination is a priority for the Biden-Harris administration, and HUD is committed to realizing the full promise of the Fair Housing Act. So, the Fair Housing Act, within the text, it mandates that we should affirmatively further fair housing, or the way that we love acronyms at HUD, we use AFFH. Yet, for most of the Fair Housing Act's history, HUD has failed to fully enforce this requirement. The United States finally took this critical step under the Obama administration in 2015 with the executive rule that demanded we affirmatively further fair housing, which established guideposts for state and local governments that received HUD funding to provide fair housing. However, that rule was barely in place, so you didn't get to see much of an effect from it before the previous administration to this one rescinded that rule not long after it came into place. This rule was such a high priority for the Biden administration coming in that President Biden issued a directive that HUD take actions that undo his patterns of historic segregation and other types of discrimination in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. In 2021, HUD published an interim final rule that restored the implementation of AFFH, that every locality and public housing agency that accepts federal housing dollars certify that they will affirmatively further fair housing. So that means if you are taking HUD money, it's not just signing a contract saying, I won't discriminate, I won't further segregation, but it's actually taking the data of your community, taking a good hard look at what de facto segregation exists as a result of decades-long, centuries-long de jure segregation that was baked in the foundation of our country, and going, okay, what are you doing with HUD's money, with the American people's money, to fix this? So this new rule coming out is going to have teeth that we hadn't seen in the previous rule, and it's very exciting to me to see that we're working to promote fair housing choice, to eliminate disparities in housing, and to foster inclusive communities, communities that were broken up by the law when redlining was in full and radiant effect years ago. While building avenues for greater accountability, this proposed rule streamlines the required fair housing analysis for local communities, states, and public housing agencies. It requires them to set ambitious goals to address fair housing issues facing their communities, among other landmark changes. This action is vital for addressing continuing segregation, disinvestment from communities of color, and ongoing discrimination in housing markets. Speaking of housing markets, a natural extension of assuring that you get access to fair housing is ensuring that you have a fair appraisal process if you own a home. Every American who buys a home should have the same opportunities to build generational wealth through home ownership. Bias in home valuations limits the ability of Black and brown communities to enjoy the financial returns associated with home ownership, thereby contributing to an already sprawling racial wealth gap. You may have already heard this story. It's been on the news a few times in a few different iterations. A Black or brown family gets their home appraised to refinance or sell, but they get an appraisal that seems lower than they expected. They then whitewash their homes by removing family pictures and cultural artifacts, and then they bring in their white friend from wherever to come and show their house to a different appraiser. The difference can be stark. In some of the stories that made the news, there's differences of appraisals in the tens of thousands of dollars. Or in one case, for the Austin family, they don't live in Austin, they're in Marin County, California, but their name is Austin. Their housing appraisal had a difference of $500,000, $500,000, because the couple was Black. For decades, bias in home valuations has limited the abilities for Black families, for brown families, to get the financial returns of home ownership, regardless of what they put into that home, regardless of what they put into that community. Right now, the median white family holds 8 times the wealth of the average Black family and 5 times the wealth of the average Latino family. Bias in home valuation process has only exacerbated this problem, especially when you're talking about Black and brown families. If they have wealth at all, so much of it is highly vested in the home and the property that they have. Some might say, well, this is just poor individual accounting. But with systemic overvaluation of homes for Black and brown owned properties when it comes to taxation, and undervaluation of Black and brown owned properties when it comes to time to sell, the accounting is designed to make individuals poor. A September report from Freddie Mac found that appraisals for home purchases in majority Black and majority Latino neighborhoods were roughly twice as likely to result in a value below the amount a buyer was willing to pay for the property, compared to appraisals in predominantly white neighborhoods. A February study from Fannie Mae found that white-owned homes are much more likely than Black-owned homes to be appraised at values that exceed algorithmic predictions. And we know that the prices of homes are often determined by comparable values of homes in that neighborhood. So one underappraised home then becomes 3, then becomes 10, then the entire neighborhood and all the folks living there miss out on building home equity. The combined missing equity could have gone to comfortable retirements, college educations, small business startups, or very simply the accumulation of generational wealth for children and grandchildren. Secretary Fudge, Secretary Marcia L. Fudge, who served as a mayor, as a member of Congress, and as the Secretary of HUD, I want to make sure y'all are clear here, had her own Ohio home appraised at $25,000 less than her white neighbor 2 doors down, despite having a bigger house and a bigger lot, and the secretary says a nicer pool. if this is happening to the Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, it can happen to the rest of us. And it very often does. And all that wealth over time and across the country adds up. Homes in predominantly black neighborhoods across the country are valued on average at $48,000 less than their predominantly white neighborhoods, for a cumulative loss in equity of approximately $156 billion. I want to emphasize this, billion with a B, of value stolen from black and brown Americans. In response to this, in 2021, the Biden-Harris administration formed the PAVE Task Force. It's a first of its kind interagency initiative co-chaired by HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge and Domestic Policy Council Advisor Susan Rice to combat this outdated and unacceptable racial bias in the housing market. About a year ago, the task force released the PAVE Action Plan, the most wide-ranging set of commitments ever announced to advance equity in the home appraisal process. The action plan represents the most wide-ranging set of reforms ever put forward to advance equity in the home appraisal process. In just 12 months, the task force has made critical progress toward fully implementing the action plan, including empowering consumers with new tools and greater awareness of appraisal bias, leveraging data to identify trends and crack down on offenders of appraisal bias, and supporting a well-trained and dynamic appraiser profession. PAVE has detailed an actionable roadmap for consumers, industry, and policymakers to address undervaluing of properties through better policies, better resources, and better data. We're doing this work because it is critical, again, that our appraisers also reflect the communities that we're serving. I want to emphasize that the appraisal industry has some pretty high barriers to entry, not including the testing, which I think it's important to have some knowledge of the profession that you are going into, but some of the requirements for apprenticeship has kept the industry highly segregated. In fact, this is probably the most segregated business in the country, at 96% white and also 80% male. And there's an even bigger struggle when it comes to talking about folks living in rural communities as well. So the Secretary, along with this task force of many wonderful federal agencies, is doing the hard work to figure out how to work with this industry or work on oversight for this industry in order to ensure that Americans get a fair shot at the American dream. We've come a long way. In January 2023, FHA shared a draft mortgage letter detailing a proposed process for prospective borrowers applying for FHA-insured loans to request a consideration of value, or ROV, on a property if the initial valuation is lower because the bias is suspected and it's illegal. In addition, we recently awarded over $28 million in grants to civil rights organizations and nonprofit organizations that are working on fair housing. This includes testing for appraisal biases and educating local communities on the issue. We're also creating a database that will work across federal agencies to improve this oversight of appraisal. The database will allow the agencies to conduct enhanced oversight and enforcement and to facilitate new research related to property valuation. But the most important work that we're doing in trying to ensure that we have fair housing, trying to ensure that we are making this country the equitable place that it needs to be, if we believe in any of the words that the founders have said, is that we work with you. We know that everyone in this country deserves to have a safe, sanitary, and stable place to call home. And in fact, the vision the Secretary has laid out for the agency isn't just something that she is saying as words, it's the experience that she has as she comes to visit communities. I have more than once seen the Secretary take out her own notepad to listen to the concerns of community members, of folks that are working in the housing space, to figure out how to better facilitate rules that may have been there long before we were considering affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so this is why I'm pleased to be here with you today. I want to encourage you to reach out to your regional office. Again, we're in the Southwest region, Region 6, and I'm based out of Fort Worth. You can find out more about us and the work that we do at HUD.gov. I also want to encourage you, even if you are not specifically a party to that discrimination, you are still able to call Fair Housing. And we also have an online form, again, available at HUD.gov, because we want to make sure that this enforcement mechanism is working for communities as it should. Building and keeping our partnership strong with you all is what enables us to do the good work that we do. As a representative of the federal government, I can do a lot of things, but I cannot be the eyes and ears on the ground. I cannot be the strength and the determination that you all have when you work in these spaces every day. So I want to thank you for that, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll turn it back to Dr. Spadania. Thank you so much.